When I saw the look on his face, something in my stomach tightened, a cold knot of fear and shame winding itself tighter and tighter. It wasn't my husband staring at me like that, though. It was him, the boy who wasn't really a boy anymore, standing in the doorway with a towel draped carelessly over his shoulder, his hair damp from the rain. His eyes held something I didn't know how to name, and that frightened me more than anything. They weren't the innocent eyes of the stepson who used to trail behind his father, asking questions about everything. These eyes were older now, and they seemed to see straight through me, through the apron I wore, through the smile I forced, through all the walls I had carefully built over the years. I told myself it was nothing, that I was only imagining it, that I was tired, that the storm outside was making me think too much. But my heart knew better. Something shifted that evening. A line was drawn, faint at first, barely visible, yet I felt it under my skin. I wish I could tell you that I stopped it before it began, that I kept my boundaries neat and unbroken, that I was stronger than my loneliness. But I wasn't. And if you'll let me, I'll tell you how that line blurred, how it disappeared, and how I crossed it without even noticing. Before I confess everything, though, tell me this, have you ever had a moment in your life when you realized too late that the ground under your feet had already given way? The day he came back was supposed to be ordinary. My husband had mentioned it in passing, almost like an afterthought, as if we were talking about the weather. "He's staying with us for a while," he'd said while checking the locks on the back door. I nodded, not thinking much of it. I'd been his stepmother for decades, though I never liked that word. It sounded like a placeholder, a note in the margins of someone else's story. When he was a boy, I packed his lunches when he visited, signed his school forms when his father forgot, but I never crossed that invisible line. I wasn't his mother. I was just there. I hadn't seen him properly in years. The last time was at a rushed holiday dinner, the kind where everyone's phones buzzed under the table and conversation was more about logistics than connection. He had been quiet then, almost shy, a tall, lanky shadow in the corner. But the man who stood on our porch that evening was not shy. He filled the doorway in a way that startled me, not just his height or his broad shoulders, but the way he carried himself, a mix of hesitation and confidence that made me feel unsteady. "Hi," he said, his voice deeper than I remembered. The word seemed too small for him now. I don't remember what I replied. Something polite, something automatic. My husband took his bags, muttered about the rain, disappeared upstairs. And suddenly it was just us in the kitchen, the sound of water dripping from his jacket onto the tile. It's strange, the details the mind clings to. I noticed his hands first. Big, sure hands with little scars across the knuckles, the kind you get from work, real work, not typing on keyboards. I asked about them, lightly, and he shrugged. "Garage," he said. "Helped a friend out. Guess I'm used to getting banged up a little." I remember smiling too quickly, turning back to the sink so he wouldn't see my face. It was an innocent answer. Ordinary. And yet I felt something shift inside me, like a floorboard creaking under unexpected weight. That night, after everyone went to bed, I stood in the laundry room folding towels and tried to name what I felt. It wasn't attraction, I told myself. Not that. Maybe it was just surprise, the shock of seeing someone grown up who I still pictured as a boy. Maybe it was loneliness, though I hated that word. It made me feel small, like something left out in the rain. The truth, though, is that I had been lonely for a long time. My marriage wasn't bad. That's what made it harder to explain, to myself, even more than to anyone else. We didn't fight. We didn't scream. We didn't break things. But somewhere along the way, we'd stopped touching. Stopped looking. Stopped noticing. The quiet between us wasn't sharp anymore, it was just there, like wallpaper you don't see until it starts to peel. When he arrived, it was like someone had opened a window in a room I'd forgotten was locked. The next morning, I found him in the kitchen making coffee. He looked almost too big for the space, leaning over the counter, tapping his fingers against the mug while the machine hissed. He turned when I walked in, and for a second, neither of us said anything. "Sleep okay?" I asked finally. "Yeah," he said. His smile was small, but it reached his eyes. We talked about nothing, the weather, the rain, the strange hum the fridge had started making. But underneath, something heavier was taking shape. Over the next few days, his presence became part of the house. He fixed a squeaky cabinet door without being asked, changed a light bulb I couldn't reach, carried heavy boxes out to the garage. Each thing was small, practical, harmless. And yet each thing left a mark. I caught myself waiting to hear his footsteps on the stairs. Wondering what he'd do next. Wondering why it mattered to me. One evening, my husband fell asleep in his chair with the TV humming low. I went into the garage to get the broom and found him there, already working, already moving boxes aside like the space belonged to him. He glanced up, smiling faintly, sweat beading at his temple. "Hope you don't mind," he said. "Just thought I'd clear some of this up." I should have told him to leave it. It wasn't his job. But instead, I stayed. I don't know why. Maybe it was because I hadn't been asked to stay for anything in so long. We talked, lightly, about tools and dust and what his plans were. I asked when he thought he'd head back to the city, and he shrugged. "Not sure," he said. "Guess I needed a break." Something in his voice made me wonder what he needed a break from, but I didn't ask. Instead, I handed him a rag. Our fingers brushed. I felt it then, that line, the one I thought I could keep clear, flicker like a weak signal. That night, lying awake beside my husband's steady breathing, I stared at the ceiling and told myself I was imagining things. That whatever I thought I felt was nothing. But even then, even in that moment, I knew that nothing had already begun to feel like something. The rain hadn't let up for days, a steady curtain that made the world outside feel distant and blurred. Inside the house, life went on in its small routines, but something had shifted, subtle as a change in the air before a storm. I noticed it most in the garage. The space had always been a kind of forgotten room, boxes stacked high, old paint cans with rusted lids, tools scattered like artifacts of a life once more hands-on. My husband rarely went in there anymore. He used to years ago, but now it was just another place for dust to collect. One afternoon, I found him there, my stepson, already working. He had rolled up his sleeves, his forearms speckled with dirt, veins and tendons shifting under his skin as he moved an old shelving unit. I stood for a moment in the doorway, unnoticed, watching how easily he seemed to fit into that neglected space. I told myself I went in to help, though I wasn't needed. He had already created a rhythm, sorting, lifting, setting aside what should be kept, what should be thrown away. There was a quiet focus about him, the kind of energy that makes you want to be near it just to feel included. I bent down to pick up a box of tangled cords, more to justify standing there than out of any real intent to help. "You don't have to do all this," I said, though I didn't mean it. He glanced at me over his shoulder, a smudge of dirt across his cheekbone. "I don't mind," he said simply. "Keeps me busy." That answer lingered in my head for reasons I couldn't quite explain. We worked side by side, the silence comfortable, broken only by the occasional scrape of a box being dragged across concrete or the dull thud of something being set on a shelf. I caught myself looking at his hands again, always his hands, the way they wrapped around the handle of a hammer, the way his fingers brushed dust from an old jar before setting it down. At one point, we both reached for the same box of tools. Our fingers touched, just for a moment, just enough for me to notice how warm his skin felt against mine. It wasn't deliberate, we both pulled back almost immediately, but there was a pause, the kind of pause that doesn't belong to ordinary accidents. I laughed softly, an awkward little sound, and said something about being clumsy. He smiled, the corners of his mouth curving in a way that made me suddenly aware of the closeness of the room, the smell of oil and wood and damp cement. The hours blurred together. At some point, he found an old photo album tucked in a crate, flipped it open to a page of yellowed pictures, my husband younger, me younger, a life that looked like a postcard from a place I couldn't return to. He held the album out, and for a moment our fingers brushed again as I took it. There was a heaviness in my chest I couldn't name. We talked about nothing, where some of the tools came from, which boxes should be thrown out. But beneath those harmless exchanges was something else, a thread of awareness I couldn't seem to untangle. When I stood to stretch my back, I realized how close he was. He moved aside immediately, polite, almost too polite, but not before I felt the brush of his shoulder against mine. And then it happened. It wasn't planned, it wasn't even thought about. One moment, I was turning to ask him about an old workbench, and the next, we kissed, It was brief, almost accidental in its clumsiness, but it wasn't meaningless. I felt the shock of it like a jolt through my whole body. I stepped back instantly, my hand half raised as if to stop time itself, though it was far too late for that. Neither of us spoke right away. He looked down, his breath uneven, while I stared at the floor, at the faint line where oil had stained the concrete. I don't know how long the silence lasted, it felt both endless and far too short. Finally, I muttered something about needing to check on dinner, though the words sounded strange in my own mouth, brittle and absurd. I left the garage, but the kiss came with me, clinging like the smell of dust in my hair, like something I couldn't wash away. That evening, I moved through the motions of routine, chopping vegetables, setting the table, my hands working on instinct while my mind replayed those few seconds over and over. The house felt different, as though the walls themselves knew. At dinner, my husband spoke about the news, about a neighbor's dog that had gone missing, about things that didn't matter. I nodded, I smiled, I passed the salt. Across the table, he sat quietly, eating without looking up much, and every time his hand reached for his glass, I remembered the warmth of his fingers brushing mine. When the dishes were washed and the lights were turned out, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my husband's steady breathing beside me. My lips still felt strange, tingling almost, as if they remembered more than I wanted them to. I told myself it was nothing. A mistake. Something to forget. But when I closed my eyes, I saw his face in that half-light of the garage, saw the way his smile faltered just before it happened, saw how neither of us had stopped it. I thought of that kiss all through the night, and when morning came, I didn't know what scared me more, the fact that it had happened, or the quiet, undeniable truth that some part of me didn't regret it. The morning after the kiss, I woke earlier than usual. Not because of an alarm or a sudden noise, but because sleep had been thin, fragile, and easy to tear. I had spent most of the night lying still, my body careful not to brush against my husband's, my mind replaying every frame of what happened in that garage. It wasn't just the kiss itself that kept looping, it was the silence before, the unspoken tension, the brush of his hand against mine, the way we both seemed to pause, as though we'd been holding our breath without realizing it. When I finally got out of bed, I moved quietly, almost guiltily, as if even my footsteps might reveal too much. The house felt different in the morning light, muted, like someone had turned the color down on the world. I went into the kitchen and started making coffee. The smell should have been comforting, grounding, but it wasn't. Every movement, measuring, pouring, stirring, was mechanical, as though I were trying to convince myself I could slip back into the same rhythm as before. But then I heard footsteps. His footsteps. Slow, steady, coming down the stairs. I felt my shoulders tense before I even turned to look. He came into the kitchen wearing a faded t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair still a little messy from sleep. There was nothing remarkable about what he wore, and yet I couldn't stop noticing the way the fabric stretched across his shoulders, how grown-up he looked standing in my kitchen, how far away the memory of him as a shy teenager felt now. "Morning," he said softly, his voice low, almost cautious. I managed a quiet good morning, and turned back to the coffee pot, staring at the drip like it held the answer to everything. The silence between us wasn't like the silences I shared with my husband, the comfortable, forgettable ones that came from years of familiarity. This silence was sharp, deliberate. Every second felt like a question neither of us wanted to answer. I handed him a cup of coffee, and when his fingers brushed mine, I felt it again, the spark, the reminder of yesterday. I pulled my hand back quickly, too quickly, and the cup nearly sloshed over. He caught it easily, steady, as if he had been ready for that. We didn't talk about it. Of course we didn't. The kiss, I mean. There was no mention, no awkward apology, no nervous laughter to dismiss it as nothing. It just hung there, invisible but heavy, like the smell of smoke long after the fire is out. Later that day, I found myself in the laundry room, sorting a basket of towels. It should have been the simplest task, one I'd done thousands of times, but that morning it felt different. The towels smelled faintly of detergent and rain, and as I folded them, I thought about the garage, about his hands, about how unplanned and inevitable that kiss had felt. I told myself I would avoid being alone with him. That seemed like the safest, simplest solution. But the house didn't make that easy. By the afternoon, my husband had gone out, something about picking up supplies, something about an errand that would take hours. That left the two of us alone. I stayed in the kitchen, trying to occupy myself with unnecessary chores, reorganizing the spice rack, wiping down a counter that was already clean. Then he walked in, holding a basket of laundry, and for a moment, we both just stood there. "Thought I'd bring these down," he said, setting the basket on the counter. His tone was even, casual, but his eyes flickered toward me for a split second too long. I nodded, my throat dry, and reached for the basket. Our fingers touched again, and it was ridiculous how much I felt it, how aware I was of the space between us shrinking every time we were in the same room. I pulled a towel from the basket and started folding, needing something, anything, to do with my hands. He did the same, standing next to me, matching my movements. We folded in silence, side by side, like it was the most normal thing in the world, even though it wasn't. Then it happened. His phone was on top of the towels, the screen lighting up as he set it aside. A notification flashed, then another. I didn't mean to look, it was instinct, a glance, but I saw more than I should have. The screen shifted to a video thumbnail before it went dark again, and in that instant, an image burned itself into my mind. I turned away immediately, my face hot, my hands clumsy as I refolded the same towel twice. I didn't want him to know I'd seen, but I couldn't erase what I'd glimpsed, couldn't push it out of my mind. He picked up his phone, unaware or maybe pretending not to notice. We kept folding towels, but the air felt thicker, charged, like a storm pressing against the walls of the house. I tried to think about anything else, the list for the grocery store, the dinner I'd have to make later, but my mind kept circling back to what I'd seen, to him, to the kiss, to the fact that I couldn't separate any of it anymore. That evening, when my husband returned, I smiled and nodded through conversation, answering questions about dinner, about the mail, about the rain that hadn't stopped. But my mind wasn't really there. Later, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling again. My husband's breathing was steady beside me, a soft rhythm I used to find comforting. But tonight it felt distant, like a lullaby from another room. The image of the phone screen replayed in my mind, blending with the memory of the kiss, with the way his fingers brushed mine over the laundry basket, with the way he had looked at me in the kitchen that morning. I told myself again that it had to stop. That I wouldn't let it go further. That I would be careful. But even as I made those promises, a quiet truth whispered underneath, The line I thought I could protect had already been smudged, and I couldn't seem to redraw it. The fourth day after the kiss felt like living inside a held breath. Every movement in the house carried a weight it hadn't before. Even the smallest sounds, a drawer sliding open, the kettle whistling, footsteps on the stairs, seemed sharper, louder, almost deliberate. I woke early again, but this time it wasn't only restless sleep that pulled me from bed. It was the uneasy awareness that the day would bring more of that same tension, the kind you can't simply decide to step away from. The rain had stopped overnight, leaving the air damp and cool. I stood at the window with my coffee, looking out at the backyard, the grass glistening with dew, the sky pale and heavy. It should have felt refreshing, but instead it only made the quiet inside the house feel heavier. I heard him before I saw him. His footsteps were different from my husband's, lighter, quicker, a rhythm I'd already learned without meaning to. When he walked into the kitchen, I turned too fast, almost like I'd been caught doing something wrong. He smiled slightly, not awkwardly but with a kind of ease that unsettled me even more. We didn't speak much that morning, only the simplest exchanges, comments about breakfast, the weather clearing, the errands my husband had mentioned the night before. But the silence between the words spoke louder than anything else. Every time our eyes met, even briefly, I felt my chest tighten. By mid-morning, the power went out. A sharp click, a pause, and then the house sank into a sudden stillness. The hum of the refrigerator stopped, the clock on the microwave went blank, and the soft whir of the ceiling fan overhead cut out. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, holding a dish towel, staring at the dead light bulb as though willing it to come back. The house felt strange without its usual noise, a deeper kind of quiet, the kind that almost echoed. "We should find candles," I said, my voice sounding louder than I expected in the sudden hush. We searched the drawers together, moving around each other in the half-light of the gray morning. Every time our arms brushed, every time we leaned past each other to check another cabinet, there was that same sharp awareness. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, it was quiet, almost polite, but it was there, shaping the space between us. By the time we'd gathered a handful of candles, the house felt like a different place. He struck a match, and the first small flame flickered to life. I watched it catch, the wick curling, the wax beginning to soften. The light threw strange shadows across the walls, soft but jagged, making the kitchen feel smaller, closer. We set candles on the table, on the counter, their glow pooling in little circles. He leaned over to straighten one, and for a moment his arm brushed mine. It was nothing, just a passing touch, but it stayed with me. We sat at the kitchen table, the two of us, the house quiet except for the faint sound of wind outside and the occasional drip of water from somewhere unseen. He told me stories then, not big stories, but fragments of his life, the kind you don't share with just anyone. Little things about the places he'd been working, about friends I'd never met, about moments that hadn't seemed to matter to anyone but him. I listened more closely than I should have. There was one story about a night he and a friend got stuck on the side of the road, their truck broken down in the middle of nowhere. He described how they'd sat in the cab, waiting for a tow, laughing at the absurdity of it, and I could see it in my mind like I'd been there. He laughed a little when he told it, and I laughed too, though I wasn't sure why, maybe because his voice sounded lighter when he spoke, maybe because I liked hearing it. He shifted in his seat at one point, turning the candle slightly, and the back of his hand brushed against mine. I didn't move. Neither did he. It wasn't a grab, not even a hold, just a lingering touch, a shared moment where neither of us spoke. I thought about saying something casual to break the moment, to make it nothing, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I stared at the flickering candlelight and thought about how strange it felt to have my hand so close to his, about how easily I could pull away and how I didn't. When my husband came home hours later, the power was still out. He commented on the candles, on the oddness of the outage, but I couldn't bring myself to meet his eyes for long. Dinner that night felt like a performance I hadn't rehearsed for. I served plates, passed glasses, and answered questions, but my mind wasn't on the conversation. My mind was still in the quiet of that kitchen, in the glow of the candles, in the brush of his hand against mine. When the power finally came back on later that evening, the house felt too bright, too loud. The lights flicked on, the hum of appliances returned, and everything looked normal again. But it didn't feel normal. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought about the way his stories had sounded in the half-light. I thought about how his hand had felt, just barely brushing mine. And I thought about the way none of this felt accidental anymore. I told myself again that I could stop it. That it was only a moment, only a mistake. But as the hours dragged on, I couldn't shake the truth that none of this felt like an accident, and that terrified me more than anything else. The following morning felt uneasy from the moment I opened my eyes. I had slept, but not deeply, just enough to let my mind run in circles around the same thoughts again and again. The kiss in the garage. The phone on the laundry pile. The brush of his hand against mine in candlelight. Each memory sat heavy in my chest, stacked one on top of the other, and I knew I couldn't keep pretending they didn't matter. My husband had left early for work, his footsteps creaking down the stairs long before the sun was fully up. When the door clicked shut, the house settled into that peculiar silence again, the one that felt fuller now, like the walls were listening. I poured coffee into a cup, my hands steady enough, but the stillness made even that small sound, the drip of the pot, the clink of the spoon against ceramic, feel magnified. By the time I heard his steps, I knew it was him before I turned. That rhythm was becoming too familiar. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair still damp from a shower, a sweatshirt hanging loose on his frame. There was nothing remarkable about his clothes, but somehow it didn't matter. He smiled slightly, that same easy half-smile that made me feel as if I'd been caught standing somewhere I wasn't meant to be. "Morning," he said softly, his voice barely louder than the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I nodded, forcing my voice to sound normal. "Morning." We didn't talk much while I finished my coffee. Every word seemed to take effort, like pushing through something thicker than air. Later, he mentioned needing to pick up some things for the garage, paint, nails, something for a shelf he'd been fixing. He offered to drive, and before I'd even thought about it, I said I'd go with him. The words left my mouth too easily, like they'd been waiting there all along. The sky was clearer when we left, the rain finally gone. The world outside smelled fresh, the kind of morning air that usually makes you breathe deeper. But in the car, the air felt different, contained, heavy, like the walls of the vehicle made every thought louder. The drive started simply enough. We talked about the store we were going to, about which road would be faster, about a song that came on the radio. But gradually, the conversation shifted. It wasn't dramatic, there was no sudden confession, no sharp turn in tone. It just softened. He said something about how he hadn't expected to stay this long, how he thought he'd only be here a week or two. I asked what had changed. He shrugged, looking out the window, then said quietly, "I guess I needed a break from things." I wanted to ask from what, but I didn't. Instead, I found myself saying, "Sometimes a break is the only way you figure out what you really want." The words surprised me. They felt too close to something I wasn't ready to name. The road stretched ahead of us, long and straight, the trees on either side washed pale by the morning light. At a stop sign, we paused. He turned his head slightly, just enough that his eyes met mine. There wasn't much in that glance, no grand statement, no question spoken aloud, but I felt it. We kept driving. A few miles later, he pulled into a small, almost empty parking lot beside an old gas station. "Thought we could stop here for a minute," he said. We sat there in the stillness of the parked car. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. Outside, the world was quiet, only the faint rustle of wind through a tree nearby. We didn't plan it. We didn't even look at each other for long. But then, we kissed, It wasn't clumsy like the first one. It wasn't an accident. It was slower this time, deliberate, the air between us heavy with everything we hadn't said. When it ended, we both turned away almost at once. He reached for the steering wheel even though the car wasn't moving. I stared out the window at the cracked pavement, the faded paint on the gas station sign, anything but him. The silence on the drive back was different from the silence before. It wasn't empty, it was thick, layered, and almost unbearable. I watched the road ahead, my mind racing, not knowing if I should speak or if speaking would make it worse. I kept thinking about the kiss, about how it hadn't felt like a mistake this time. When we reached the house, we didn't talk about it. We carried the bags from the store inside, set them on the counter, and moved through the motions of normalcy. But everything had changed. That evening, I tried to cook dinner as if nothing had happened. I chopped vegetables, stirred a pot, wiped down the counter. Each task felt hollow, as though my body was going through the steps while my mind stayed behind in the car. When my husband came home, he asked how the trip to the store went. I smiled, I answered, I passed him his plate. All the while, the memory of that kiss clung to me like smoke, unseen but impossible to ignore. Later that night, I lay in bed once more, staring at the ceiling in the dark. I could hear my husband's steady breathing beside me, and it felt like listening to something from far away. I touched my lips with the back of my hand, not to remember the kiss, but because I couldn't forget it. I told myself I needed to stop this. That there was still time to pull away. But beneath all of that, a quieter voice whispered the truth I didn't want to hear, I didn't want to stop. The day after that second kiss felt heavier than any day before it, as if the walls of the house had taken notice, as if they were leaning in closer, listening. I woke up before the sun again, lying in bed while my husband snored softly beside me. The room felt smaller somehow, the air too thick, my own breathing too loud in my ears. I couldn't stop replaying it, the drive, the stop at that old gas station, the way the world outside had gone quiet in that single moment before we kissed. When I got up, the house was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak in the floorboards. I busied myself with the familiar, making coffee, wiping down the kitchen counter, straightening a stack of mail that didn't need straightening. But none of it could settle my mind. Every task felt like pretending. He came downstairs later, and when I heard his footsteps, I froze for a moment, my hands stilling on the dish towel I held. It was the strangest thing, how I could tell it was him without looking, how my body responded before my mind had even caught up. When he walked into the kitchen, his face was unreadable, not tense, not casual, just blank, as if he too hadn't decided how this day would go. I greeted him, my voice low, almost cautious. He said morning back, his tone even. We went about our morning in silence that wasn't comfortable but wasn't hostile either. It was the kind of silence where every clink of a mug or brush of a sleeve seemed to matter. I told myself I would keep busy. That I wouldn't put myself in situations where we were alone together for long. But it's amazing how a house conspires against you in ways you don't expect. By mid-morning, I was carrying a basket of laundry to the basement, arms full of towels and sheets. Halfway down the stairs, I heard his voice behind me, "Here, let me help with that." Before I could protest, he had taken the basket from my arms, carrying it the rest of the way down with effortless ease. We stepped into the small laundry room, the smell of detergent and faint dampness hanging in the air. I told myself I would just sort the laundry quickly and leave. But then I stayed. The two of us worked side by side in that cramped room, folding sheets, stacking towels, pulling clothes from the dryer. Every time our hands reached for the same item, we brushed against each other. It happened once, twice, 3 times, little touches, quick and harmless, except they didn't feel harmless. I noticed things I shouldn't have been noticing, the way his sleeves bunched around his forearms, the veins in his hands when he gripped the edge of the laundry basket, the warmth in his voice when he asked simple questions like, "Where does this go?" I answered automatically, but my thoughts were tangled. At one point, he handed me a shirt, and our fingers overlapped for longer than they should have. Neither of us moved right away. The touch wasn't overt, wasn't deliberate, but it was enough to make my breath catch for just a moment. The quiet between us deepened. The only sounds were the dryer's low hum and the soft fold of fabric. I told myself to leave. To go upstairs. To find something else, anything else, to do. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself slowing down, folding towels more carefully, pretending to smooth wrinkles that weren't there just so I wouldn't have to leave the room yet. My thoughts were loud. They crowded my head, colliding with each other until I couldn't tell which voice belonged to sense and which belonged to impulse. I thought about my husband. About the quiet that had crept into our marriage over the years. About how long it had been since I'd felt seen, not just noticed, but seen. And then I thought about the gas station. The kiss. The way his eyes had met mine before it happened, like we'd both understood what we were about to do before we did it. I shook my head slightly, as though I could scatter those thoughts, but they didn't go anywhere. When the laundry was done, he carried the basket back upstairs. I followed, my steps slow, my mind restless. The rest of the day passed in fragments. I cooked lunch. He fixed something in the garage. My husband called to say he'd be home late. And all through it, that same undercurrent ran beneath everything, quiet but persistent, a steady pull. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the house grew dim, I found myself standing in front of the mirror in the bedroom, brushing my hair with more care than usual. I wasn't dressing up, not really, but I wasn't not dressing up either. I noticed it. And the fact that I noticed made me feel guilty. I told myself it was only because I'd been feeling unseen for so long, that it was harmless to want to look nice, to feel alive again in some small way. But I also knew the truth. Every choice I made now felt like part of a larger pattern, one I couldn't fully ignore. When I went downstairs, he was sitting at the kitchen table, his head bent over something, maybe a list, maybe nothing at all. He looked up when I walked in, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. It was only a second. Maybe less. But in that second, I felt it again, the quiet awareness, the thing that sat between us like an unspoken agreement. I turned away, reaching for the kettle, trying to fill the silence with the sound of water running. But the silence stayed. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only getting heavier. That night began the same way as so many others, quietly, almost forgettably. My husband had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long day, his familiar footsteps climbing the stairs, the creak of the bedroom door closing behind him. I stayed downstairs, claiming I had dishes to finish, though the plates were already washed and stacked neatly. In truth, I just wasn't ready to face the darkness of the bedroom, the weight of my thoughts pressing down with no distraction left to soften them. The house felt different once the upstairs light switched off. There was a stillness that wasn't simply quiet, it was complete. Even the hum of the appliances seemed muted, like the entire house was holding its breath. I moved slowly through the kitchen, drying a mug that didn't need drying, wiping the counter again. Each motion was deliberate, a way to postpone the inevitable moment when I'd have to turn off the lights and follow my husband upstairs. I didn't hear him at first. It wasn't until I glanced toward the living room and saw the faint, warm glow of a lamp that I realized someone else was awake. My stepson was sitting on the couch, one knee bent, his head tilted slightly forward as if he'd been deep in thought. The sight startled me, not because it was strange for him to be there, but because I hadn't expected it. He looked up when I appeared in the doorway, and in that small glance everything shifted. I should have said something simple, "Are you okay?" or "I thought you were asleep," but no words came out at first. I stood there for a beat too long, holding the dish towel like a shield. He didn't look surprised to see me, though. If anything, there was something steady in his expression, as though he'd known I would walk in. I finally murmured something about not being able to sleep, my voice quieter than I intended. He nodded slightly, the smallest acknowledgement, and patted the space on the other end of the couch. It wasn't a request, not even an invitation, it was just a gesture, as if to say the space was there if I wanted it. I should have stayed standing. I should have said goodnight and walked upstairs. Instead, I sat down. The couch felt too small. The distance between us wasn't much, just a few feet, but it felt like nothing at all. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the occasional creak of the house settling, the low hum of the lamp. Everything else was silence. We didn't talk for a while. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't sound absurd or unnecessary. I glanced at him, just once, and he was already looking at me. There was no awkwardness in his gaze, only a calm, deliberate stillness that made my breath catch for the briefest moment. I turned away, but not quickly enough. It happened slowly, not in a rush, not in a burst of impulse, but like the inevitable pull of water flowing downhill. One moment, we were sitting there, the soft light of the lamp pooling around us, and the next, the space between us had vanished. We spent the night together. The house stayed silent, as though it had been stripped of sound altogether. When I woke in the early hours, the world was still dark, the faintest light of dawn not yet touching the edges of the sky. I sat up carefully, every movement deliberate, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for the blanket that had slipped to the floor. The room looked the same as it always had, the same worn rug, the same photos on the shelves, the same lamp casting a weak glow, but nothing felt the same. The air felt thick, almost heavy, as if it knew too much. I stood, my knees unsteady for reasons that had nothing to do with balance, and looked toward the stairs. My husband was still asleep upstairs. That fact settled over me like a weight I couldn't shift. I gathered the cups from the coffee table, there had been tea earlier, though I couldn't even remember drinking it, and carried them into the kitchen. The sound of ceramic against the sink seemed too loud, the clink echoing in the stillness. I told myself to breathe. To think. To find something, anything, that could make sense of what had just happened. But there was no way to make sense of it. There was only the undeniable fact that the line I had drawn for myself, the one I had promised not to cross, was gone. Completely gone. The first hint of dawn crept through the curtains as I stood there, staring at the sink. The light didn't comfort me. It felt like exposure, like truth edging its way in. I turned off the lamp in the living room and glanced once more at the couch before going upstairs. I didn't pause to look too long. I didn't want to. I climbed the stairs slowly, careful not to make a sound. The door to my bedroom creaked softly as I opened it. My husband stirred, half asleep, and mumbled something incoherent. I slid into bed beside him, the mattress dipping under my weight, and lay there staring at the ceiling, my eyes open long after the sun began to rise. The morning after was different. The house felt the same worn floor under my feet, the same hum of the refrigerator, the same muted light leaking through the curtains, but every step I took felt heavier. It wasn't guilt alone that weighed on me. It was the awareness that nothing would ever be the same, no matter how much I wished it could be. I woke before the alarm, my eyes opening to the gray light of dawn. My husband's breathing was even and deep beside me. I turned my head and looked at him for a long time, wondering if he would sense something if he opened his eyes and met my gaze. But he didn't stir, not even when I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, careful to avoid the familiar creak in the floorboard near the door. Downstairs, the living room looked almost untouched. The lamp on the side table was still slightly crooked from where I'd turned it off. The blanket we'd used lay draped over the arm of the couch, not messy but not neat either. I stared at it for a moment, my hand hovering as if I might fold it, but I didn't. I moved into the kitchen and reached for the coffee pot. The motions felt automatic, filling the reservoir, measuring the grounds, pressing the button, but they weren't simple anymore. Every sound seemed amplified, the gurgle of water, the hiss of the first steam, the click of the cup on the counter. Each one felt like a reminder. When I turned, he was already there. He stood in the doorway, leaning slightly against the frame, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It wasn't an awkward silence, but it wasn't comfortable either. It was the kind of silence that holds everything unsaid between two people like a fragile object no one dares touch. I forced my voice to be steady. "Coffee's almost ready," I said. He nodded once and stepped into the kitchen, his movements easy, quiet. He poured himself a cup when it finished brewing, and I noticed his hand shake, not much, just the faintest tremor that might have been nothing. We didn't speak of the night before. Not a word. And that silence felt louder than any confession could have been. All through breakfast, I caught myself looking at him, then looking away. My husband came down the stairs, rubbing his eyes, talking about the day ahead, and I felt my breath shorten. I listened to him talk, answered his questions, passed him toast, and all the while I was aware of the other presence at the table. He spoke very little. He didn't need to. The quiet from him said enough. When my husband left for work, the door shutting behind him seemed to leave an echo. The house felt too still. I thought about leaving too, even just to the store, but I stayed. I told myself I needed to do laundry, to sort through the pantry, to sweep the porch. Anything but run. I found myself in the living room, standing at the window, staring at the street. I heard him behind me before I saw him. "We should probably talk," he said, his voice low, measured. I turned slightly but didn't meet his eyes right away. I didn't trust what might show on my face. "What is there to say?" I replied, my voice almost as quiet as his. He didn't answer immediately. The pause stretched long enough that I wondered if he would say anything at all. Finally, he said, "Nothing's the same now." The words were simple, almost flat, but they landed hard. I thought about that for a long time after he left the room. About how true it was. The rest of the day felt like trying to pretend life hadn't shifted. I cleaned the counters. I folded towels. I watered the plants. But each movement felt staged, as if I were trying to convince myself I could step back into the version of me from before. In the afternoon, I stood in front of the mirror in the upstairs bathroom. My reflection looked the same, hair tied back loosely, a plain sweater, tired eyes, but it felt different. I felt different. I wondered if my husband would see it. That evening, he came home at his usual time. He asked the usual questions. "How was your day? Did you need anything from the store?" I answered each one smoothly, automatically, like a well-practiced routine. But as we sat at the table, the weight of what had happened stayed with me. It clung to me, quiet but undeniable. Later, when the dishes were washed and the lights were off, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling again. My husband shifted in his sleep, rolling slightly closer, his arm brushing against mine. I stayed still, eyes open in the dark, listening to his breathing. I knew the truth, even if I couldn't say it out loud. I had crossed a line that couldn't be redrawn, and the silence in our house would never sound the same again. The next morning felt brittle, as though one wrong move might crack the thin layer of normalcy I was trying to keep in place. I woke up to the soft murmur of my husband moving around the bedroom, the faint clatter of hangers in the closet as he chose a shirt. I pretended to still be asleep, my breathing steady, my body still. It was easier that way, easier than facing his eyes and wondering if he'd see something I couldn't hide. When he left for work, the house seemed to exhale. I lay there a moment longer before getting up, staring at the dent his body had left in the mattress, the familiar pattern of the quilt between my fingers. The silence that followed his departure wasn't comforting, it was the kind that left too much room for my thoughts to echo. Downstairs, the kitchen was flooded with weak morning light. The countertops gleamed from the night before, wiped down twice over just so I could keep my hands busy. I made coffee again, though I wasn't sure I wanted any. The smell filled the air, a smell I had always liked, but now it felt too strong, like it belonged to a routine I couldn't step into anymore. He came into the kitchen a few minutes later. His hair was slightly damp, his expression careful, as if he wasn't sure how the day would unfold. There was no trace of the calm I'd seen in him the night before. Instead, there was something sharper, a quiet tension he was trying to keep contained. We exchanged a few words, just the kind anyone might, about coffee, about the weather, about nothing at all, but they felt heavy, clumsy. Each word seemed to trip over the weight of what wasn't being said. I spent the morning trying to busy myself. I folded laundry that didn't need folding, moved things from one drawer to another, swept a floor that was already clean. But no matter what I did, my mind kept circling back to that night, to the stillness afterward, to the way my own heartbeat had felt like the loudest thing in the room. By the afternoon, the house had grown warmer, the kind of warmth that makes the air feel thick. My husband called to check in, just a quick, casual call, but even that made my stomach tighten. He asked how the day was going. I told him everything was fine. The word came out too quickly, too easily, like a reflex. I turned and saw him standing in the doorway when I hung up the phone. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't frowning either. He just watched me for a long second, his hands in his pockets, his weight shifted slightly to one side. "Was that him?" he asked quietly. I nodded, forcing my voice to sound even. "Yes. Just asking about dinner." There was another silence, the kind I was getting used to, though I didn't think I ever really would. He didn't move, and neither did I. Finally, he said, "Things can't just keep going like this." The words landed like a stone in my chest. He wasn't angry. He wasn't demanding. He was simply stating a fact, and the truth of it was undeniable. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I turned back to the sink, rinsing a glass that didn't need rinsing. "I know," I said finally, though I wasn't sure what exactly I meant by it, or what he thought I meant. The rest of the day was an exercise in restraint. I avoided being in the same room with him for too long, but somehow we kept crossing paths anyway, in the hallway, in the laundry room, on the back porch. Each time, the space between us felt like a live wire, buzzing quietly under the surface. When evening came, I cooked dinner as I always did. The smells of garlic and onions filled the kitchen, the sizzle of oil in the pan breaking the quiet. My husband came home, kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day. I smiled, nodded, answered his questions. All of it felt rehearsed. But he lingered in the kitchen longer than usual, his eyes flicking between us, between me, between the one stirring the pot and the one sitting at the table. He didn't say anything outright, but there was a question in the way he looked at us, as if he couldn't quite name what he was sensing but knew something wasn't right. After dinner, we washed dishes together, my husband and I. His hands worked methodically, drying plates, stacking them neatly. I caught him glancing at me once, twice, his brow furrowed just slightly. When the kitchen was clean, he went upstairs earlier than usual, saying he was tired. The sound of his footsteps on the stairs felt heavier than they should have, like they were carrying more than just his weight. I stayed downstairs, sitting at the table long after he'd gone, staring at the small ring of water left from a glass. The house felt split in two, one part carrying on with the familiar rhythm, the other humming with something unspoken and dangerous. When I finally went upstairs, I found my husband already asleep. I stood in the doorway for a long time before getting into bed. I lay there in the dark, listening to his breathing, and I knew, no matter how much I wished otherwise, he could sense something. Maybe he couldn't name it yet, but he felt it. And that terrified me almost as much as the truth itself. The last few days felt like walking through a fog, one that thickened no matter how many times I told myself it would clear. Every corner of the house seemed to hold echoes of the past week, the garage with its faint smell of oil, the couch in the living room where the lamp had cast that soft, warm light, the kitchen counter where my hands had lingered on a towel just to have something to hold. Each space felt like both a refuge and an accusation, and I couldn't tell which weighed on me more. That morning, I sat at the kitchen table long after the coffee had gone cold. My husband had already left for work, his familiar routine steady as ever, though his eyes lately carried a shadow of something, confusion, maybe suspicion, that he hadn't yet named out loud. I had felt it the night before in the way he lingered when he said goodnight, the pause before he turned off the lamp, the way his hand rested on the doorknob as if he'd meant to ask something but thought better of it. I stared at the coffee cup in front of me, the thin ring of liquid clinging to the bottom, and wondered if I could keep pretending. Pretending that the kiss in the garage had been a slip. Pretending that the second kiss in the car had been another slip. Pretending that that night, the night when everything had been crossed, could somehow be folded into the same category of accident. But the truth sat there, blunt and undeniable, it wasn't an accident. None of it had been for a long time. I heard him come downstairs. Not my husband, him. His footsteps were different. I knew them instantly, lighter, quicker, somehow careful and careless at once. He appeared in the doorway, and the sight of him made my breath stutter for a moment, though I hoped it didn't show. "Morning," he said. I nodded, the word catching in my throat before I managed to return it. We didn't talk much after that. The silence between us had become its own language, one I was starting to understand too well. He moved around the kitchen easily, his presence filling the space in a way that made it impossible to ignore him. Every glance, every pause, every moment of eye contact felt sharper now, as if it carried the weight of everything that had happened and everything that couldn't be undone. Later that day, he began gathering his things. Slowly at first, just a book here, a jacket there, until it became clear that this time, he wasn't just tidying up. He was leaving. I stood in the doorway to the guest room, watching him fold a shirt, then another, each movement quiet, steady, deliberate. He didn't look at me when he said, "I think it's time." My throat felt tight. Time for what? The words sounded foolish the moment they left my mouth. He glanced up then, his eyes meeting mine, and for a second neither of us spoke. "To go," he said simply. There wasn't anger in his voice, or even hesitation, just a quiet finality that made my chest ache in a way I hadn't expected. I nodded, though the gesture felt small, almost meaningless. We didn't speak much after that. I helped him fold a sweater, smoothed the edges of the fabric just to have something to do with my hands. Every time our fingers brushed, it felt like a reminder of all the times they'd lingered too long. When his bag was packed, he set it by the door. The house felt different instantly, emptier, though he hadn't even left yet. He stood there for a moment, one hand resting lightly on the strap of his bag, the other hanging loosely at his side. He looked around the room, then back at me. There were no grand words. No explanations, no promises, no apologies. Just a long, quiet look, one that carried everything we hadn't said and everything we never would. And then he opened the door. The sound of it closing behind him was softer than I expected. I stood there, staring at the space where he'd been, at the bag-shaped dent in the carpet, at the door he'd just walked through. The house felt still, heavier somehow, as if it had absorbed the weight of all that had happened. I walked through each room slowly, the garage, the laundry room, the kitchen, the living room. Each one felt altered, like it held a shadow I couldn't scrub away. When my husband came home later, the house looked the same to him. Dinner was on the table, the dishes were washed, the mail was stacked neatly by the door. But I knew it wasn't the same. I smiled when he asked how the day had been, and the smile felt like something I'd practiced. I answered his questions. I passed him a glass of water. I sat across from him at the table, my hands folded neatly in my lap. But later, after the lights were turned off and the house went quiet again, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the darkness pressing down on me. I thought about the couch, the garage, the candlelight, the 2 kisses, and that night. I thought about the bag by the door, the quiet look he'd given me before leaving. And I thought about how, no matter how much I wished for it, there was no way back. The silence in the house was different now. Not empty. Not full. Just different, forever.